Welcome to Philosophic Dialogues from La Frontera, Student Edition. I'm Jasmine Gracia. I'm a fellow from the Humanities Collaborative with UTEP and EPCC. Joining us will be Dr. Moyna, Professor of Hispanic Linguistics in the Department of Global Languages and Literatures at Texas A&M. Her main interests are language variation and change in Spanish, with particular references to word formation through compounding. Some of her research projects include forms of addresses in Uruguayan Spanish, along with Mexican-American Voices, a history of Spanish-English code mixing in the U.S. Southwest, and Out of the Mouths of Babes, child acquisition as a factor in language change. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Moyna.
Hi.
Okay, so my first question is, are speakers aware that they are code switching?
It depends. I don't think that speakers are, for the most part, aware of specifically when they are code switching. There is a general idea of when, in what context, the use of Spanish and English alternatively, which is what we call code switching, is acceptable, and so it is deployed. But if you go back to a speaker and you ask them specifically, were you speaking in Spanish only, in English only, or were you mixing both? They probably can't recall. And it's only when they hear themselves, for example, in a recording, that they will notice exactly what it is they speak. So code switching happens at a level that is not always entirely, within the control of one's awareness of or consciousness, if you like.
Can we consider that Spanglish phenomenon is a hybridization of both cultures, and it kind of pays, homage to both of them equally, or is there like a preference for either or?
Okay, so the first thing there is to talk about Spanglish. Most linguists do not use the term Spanglish to refer to the use of Spanish and English together as it is done, for example, in the United States. Mm-hmm. We talk about it, we call it Spanish in the United States. And so there's many characteristics that Spanish in the United States has, and each one of those has a different name. Spanglish, people who call the use of Spanish and English alternatively in the United States do not seem to know, don't seem to be able to pinpoint exactly what it is that they mean. It could mean the use of borrowing here and there, so a word of Spanish when you speak in English, a word of English when you speak in Spanish, but it can be more like using or combining entire stretches of one language and the other in alternation. All those things in linguistics have different names because they have different properties, and so Spanglish per se is not a term that the vast majority of linguists like to use. There are some people, both within the linguistic community and outside, who say, well, that is what the speakers of Spanish in the United States call their language, and as such, it is a perfectly appropriate term to use because it has been, adopted by the speakers who employ it. But the jury is still out, and the big problem with the word code switching, the term code switching, is that it is unclear exactly what it means. When linguists talk about the Spanish as it is spoken in the United States, they can pinpoint to the various characteristics that it has and analyze each individually. And so depending on who the speaker is, there will be more of one or the other of these features. So for example, first generation new arrivals, migrants or immigrants who come to the United States, or either from a Spanish-speaking country or from Puerto Rico, they tend to favor Spanish in their everyday life. But because they live in the United States, and the longer they stay in the United States, the more they need terms of English to refer to new realities that they do not have terms in their own language for. So for example, a lot of people will speak in Spanish, and all about, parents of the students who go to UTEP, they will be speaking in Spanish, and they will say that los niños están yendo al college. Well, why? Because college is not quite like education institutions in Mexico, say. And sure, you can say something else. You can say universidad, but it doesn't feel the same way. So to refer to a new reality, you use a new name, even though that is not the language of your preference. There's many examples like that of terminology that is learned and used specifically in the United States. That's one way in which, this mixing of languages occurs. And that can happen with people who are not very proficient in English. They can be monolingual in Spanish, really, because borrowings, bringing a word from a different language into your own, is something that has been done for thousands of years. Every time there is language contact, the people who speak different languages will, steal or adopt words from it. We call them borrowings, but they are not borrowings in the sense that you don't return them ever. So that's one way in which this manifests. But then there's the second and third and generations. They tend to have a much more hybrid way of life in which whatever the family life and the social life are quite different. And so in one of them, Spanish is much more prevalent, and the other one, English, is much more prevalent. So those speakers tend to have different preferences or different combinations of languages depending on who they speak to, right? So they go back home and they will speak mostly in Spanish with their parents because they know that their parents mostly speak Spanish, and their grandparents even more. And then they will turn to their peers or to the brothers and sisters, and they will mix languages or use English entirely. So it isn't so much that you have more or less loyalty towards the languages themselves, but that you have a repertoire of languages and linguistic capacities, abilities, we like, skills, and you deploy them differently in the different contexts that you are in. Interestingly, you always do the right thing. Look, a bilingual speaker never talks to their monolingual abuela in English because it would not fulfill any communicative purpose. So, there's a great deal of skill in knowing who to use what with, and students or children, because it starts in childhood, have the most interesting ways to reach conclusions about who needs to be addressed in what language. Probably everybody has the experience at some point of seeing a person who could not possibly be a Spanish-speaking person, right? Because of some reason that is unacknowledged of what you expect a Spanish speaker to look like. And then that person blurts out Spanish and you're shocked. My daughter, for example, who went to a dual immersion program, her math teacher in, I don't know, the 5th grade, was called Mrs. Salyer. She was very, very blonde, and she was going to be teaching Spanish and math in Spanish. And I recall when she came back and she was shocked that this very blonde person was from Mexico, and who knew, right? So at first she had not expected that at all. And so she, and this is the kind of information that we use to make decisions about who we're going to talk to in what language. I've had the experience of going to South Texas I'm in north of Houston, but I've been to the border multiple times. And I remember one time I was in Raymondville, which is quite close to Falfurria, so the border. And we went into this little restaurant, which was a very local restaurant, fantastic local restaurant. And everybody was code switching around us. And we started to speak to the waitress, to the waiting person in Spanish, because we were all a group that was coming back from a conference, and we were all Spanish speakers. And it took her like 10 minutes to figure out, oh, I can speak in Spanish with them because they're speaking Spanish to me, which means she had an idea in her mind of what her Spanish-speaking customers should look like. And we did not look like that. We were not locals. She probably was used to using Spanish and English mixed only with her local customers. And except if the very obviously Americans came, who she probably also knew from having seen them in the restaurant many times. So she had her customer base classified, right? And all of a sudden she has these people who don't look like they're from there. She doesn't know them, and she speaks to them in English because that's what you do with people that you don't know, outsiders. And it took a while, and then she started speaking to us in Spanish. And of course, she was very curious about why we spoke Spanish and where we were from and how strange her Spanish was, because it wasn't quite the Spanish that they expected. So, but that shows you we shocked her in the sense that we were not the kind of person that she expected to be able to use the Spanish and English repertoire with. So, but that just shows you that for the most part, people are extremely adept at going back and forth between them and using what is appropriate in the situation. And that's determined by who they are speaking to, but also where they are speaking and what the conversation is about. So it's not really a matter of loyalty to the language, but a general knowledge of what languages are appropriate in which contexts. And nobody ever teaches you that, and yet you know it, right? It just shows the incredible sophistication of bilingual speakers. And monolingual speakers have the same thing with their different registers. Don't get me wrong, I'm not dissing on monolingual speakers, but bilingual speakers have even more. It's like they have, they can dance even more different steps, and they combine them in even more different ways. Monolinguals have a smaller inventory of things that they do.
I like that. And I also kind of want to pinpoint one of the things you said earlier about how parents, or I guess maybe the older generation, may feel more inclined to kind of use like certain like languages, like you said, college, instead of using colegio universitario or something like that. They'll say like college. And I've noticed my mom say those things where like she's talking about me and she's kind of trying to relay information to like maybe my Nina. She'll be like, oh, like she está en la escuela, or she's like, oh, she's at like she'll mix it up. And it's so it's very interesting to see like maybe from their observational standpoint what words they see maybe surfacing a lot, and they'll kind of use those, bring those into context and kind of mix them into their English, Spanglish and stuff like that. So I guess, I don't know if you've noticed if like there's like a selection of words you see pop up more often, more frequently, just based off exposure, kind of like colegio, like the relevance in conversation maybe.
There's a very interesting study that was done way back in the 80s by two researchers who worked, they're now retired, in New York City. So they looked at people, Puerto Ricans, of course, are the large Spanish-speaking population in New York, especially at that time. And so they interviewed the same speakers twice about basically the same topic, so nothing exotic. But one time the interview was about life in Puerto Rico, and the other interview was about life in the United States. Same people, same topics, the life story, right? And for example, when they spoke about Puerto Rico, they would use the word comedor when they were referring to the high school lunchroom, right? But when they spoke about the equivalent thing in New York, they would call it the lunchroom. Even when they were speaking in Spanish, in both cases, they were talking, same speakers with the same interlocutor speaking in the same language. Sometimes they use the word comedor, and sometimes they use the word lunchroom. And then what transpired was that comedor and lunchroom were not the same thing. Although, you look at those things and you go, well, this is a translation of this. But they were not, because in Puerto Rico, the comedor functioned differently from the American lunchroom, right? The American lunchroom sold hot food, say, and the Puerto Rican one did not. The Puerto Rican one was just tables and chairs where students would come with their own food and eat. But it wasn't a place where you could purchase food, for example. I can't remember the details, but that's the essence of it. Another example like that was in Spanish, they used the word edificio when they were talking about Puerto Rico. And when they were talking about the United States, New York, they would say building. And so, again, edificios were not the New York skyscrapers. But a building could be a New York skyscraper or the sorts of huge, project-like buildings where they lived. Why? Because an edificio in Puerto Rico had a different, fit in a different place, had different meaning. So that's why your mom sometimes says, prepa, and sometimes says high school, because they're not the same thing. Prepa is whatever you do in Mexico, and high school is whatever you do in the United States, and it works differently. It has different schedule, different courses, So yeah, the Spanish and English, which we often think of as the translations of each other, the translations really are just about the very basic meaning, right? Of course, yeah, after you finish your middle school, then you move on. When you're I don't know, 16, you're in high school in the United States and you're in prepa in Mexico. But other than that, everything else is different. The types of buildings, the types of curriculum, the extracurricular activities, all that. So that's why you need two words, because they're not the same reality, right? Each word derives meaning from the culture that wrought it. And so, yeah.
And you previously mentioned that you currently reside in Houston, but you have made trips to El Paso, sorry.
My border.
The border.
My border here.
Yes, the border.
You guys are way too far. Although I have been to El Paso, but I've never driven to El Paso. I've driven kind of past El Paso. Like I've always turned north before I make it to the different time zone. But yeah, we have, if you go straight from where I am, I'm an hour and a half north of Houston, more or less. So if I keep going, I end up in McAllen, pretty much. So 8 hours away. If I keep going and going, I end up in McAllen. Okay. So that's my closest border area, really.
So you reside in Houston, but you have been to the border. So I was wondering if from observations or personal experience, is there anything else that you have noticed in trying to balance both identities in the realm of language, maybe versus the border and in Houston, if there's like maybe more of a challenge in balancing those identities when it comes to language or any other realms of it?
Well, I don't live in Houston, so I really don't have a very good grasp of how Spanish is functioning in Houston right now. But I'm in a small college town, which is, over an hour away. But of course, it's going to be much easier to maintain your Spanish when you are right there on the border for multiplicity of reasons. The first one being that the border areas have been historically much more connected to Mexico than to the United States. All the border areas all the way to San Antonio, actually. So that's not the border anymore. That's like 3 hours in. We're much more connected historically because of with Monterrey, because the train would take you from Monterrey to San Antonio before there was any train that would take you to San Antonio from the north. So, the connection was always stronger with Mexico, and it has not. Of course, it's become San Antonio and the border have more and more people from different places, but the border region continues to be 70, 80, 90% Hispanic, depending on what specific county you're looking at. Whereas in Houston, you have a much more, Houston is a much more segregated city. Again, historically, there was not a lot of appetite for accepting Spanish-speaking migrants or immigrants until quite late, the 70s and 80s. So the concentration of Hispanics was very small for a long time, and then it exploded. So it's much more recent. Spanish in Houston has been a phenomenon that has mushroomed in the last 30 years, say. So that makes a huge deal of difference. Houston has many areas that continue to be majority white. If you look at a map of Houston, the demographics, and Houston also had a lot of redlining, meaning that neighborhoods were not available for people of different ethnicities because they would not be allowed to live there for many, in spite of the Civil Rights Act and so on and so forth. So to this day, you can see that in the map of Houston, that there are some neighborhoods that are highly with high concentrations of African Americans, others have high concentrations of Hispanics, others have high concentrations of Anglo white populations and Asians to a certain extent. So there's more and more mixing, of course, because redlining is illegal, and so. But to this day, Houston is quite segregated. There's indices that measure segregation and show that Houston continues to be a rather segregated city in the United States. Whereas on the border, well, there's really no way you can separate. If you wanted to not live amongst Hispanics, then you could not live there at all, because there's, the concentration of Hispanics is such that it's very hard to not live in a culture that is highly Hispanic, not just linguistically, but every other way, right? culturally. And so there's always been a much bigger connection with Mexico, which is part of the reason all this has survived for so long and has no reason. I don't see any reason why it would stop. Whereas with Houston, it's 6 hours away, so it really isn't a border town. It's a different kind of town.
How often do bilingual artists switch between their codes, and is it the same or different as what other bilinguals do?
All right. So I've been doing research on this now for about 5 years, 6 years. So this is, my study of bilingualism has been historic. So I looked at documents for a long time. And then when I moved, that was when I was living in California for the most part. And then I moved here, and instead of looking at documents, I started looking at popular music. So with a couple of colleagues and with one colleague mainly, and a couple of undergraduate and graduate students, we have been looking at bilingualism in music, in the music of Texas specifically, or at least the border, for now 5 or 6 years. So what you find in music, and not just in Spanish English code switching in music, but in all music that is code switched, there's many. Of course, because there's a lot of migration between different cultures, you have bilingual, multilingual music in many countries. Like, so France has Arab, French code switched music, and K-pop is another way in which you see, the combination of languages and music, and so on and so forth. There's so many different ways. But on the border, specifically in the United States, when people think of bilingual music, they think of, Pitbull, right? Much more non-border artists that come from urban contexts, and the music is urban contemporary music. But if you look, and it looks like this came out of, a 20th or 21st century phenomenon, and it didn't exist before. But if you start to dig, there is quite a bit of bilingual music from earlier. The earliest person that we have been able to locate and study who had a lot of bilingual, songs in his repertoire is that guy called Eduardo Guerrero. And he was born in Tucson, and then he lived in LA as well as, Arizona a little bit, and Vegas, and so on and so forth. So most of his songs were in Spanish, but he does have about 1/5 of his repertoire has a mixing of Spanish and English. And typically what artists do, starting with him and all the ones who came after, typically what they do is not very different from what we do in speech. But of course they have to do it less, because they don't really know what sort of an interlocutor they have when you think about it, right? If I'm talking to you, I know you, I have information about you, and I have very immediate feedback. If I use a word in English and you don't understand, I know I'm not supposed to use English with you. So I can adapt my hybrid usage or my code switching or whatever to your abilities. But if I'm producing records or singing on a stage, I don't know who I have in front of me. I have many different people with many different linguistic abilities. So most bilingual musicians will moderate these impulses. So they will use English or Spanish or whatever it is they're mixing, but sporadically and in ways that they know the audience will understand. For example, another group that has done similar things much more recently is the Texas Tornadoes, which is a San Antonio band. In their first record, they had a little glossary, which was really not meant, it was meant in jest, but the idea was, because the words that were on the glossary weren't particularly difficult to understand, but they were there to acknowledge, some of you will not understand the Spanish, but and we're grateful that you bought the record anyway, and here's a list of words in English just for the fun of it. I had no ambitions of being extensive or exhaustive or anything like that. So but artists do have to keep that in mind, because that's how your audience is designed, right? If you use a lot of code switching, then you're excluding people who do not have access to the two languages. You do find more of that intense code switching in certain styles, like, for example, rap. So if you look at somebody like Chingo Bling from, that's a person from Houston. He code mixes so much that if you don't speak both languages, you just cannot follow along. You don't know what he says. You don't know, you cannot interpret what he means. But other artists tend to be more easier to more accessible, if you like. So for the most part, then the style, the things that they borrow words, they mix, a part of a sentence from a language with another part of a sentence from another language, or they will combine a stanza in one language and another stanza in the other language. Oftentimes they will be the translation. So this is the English, and here's the same thing in Spanish. So there is always some awareness or some effort made to be comprehensible, because that's how you build following. So they don't do anything weird other than, of course, rhyming, which is very weird about music in general, right? We do not go around speaking in rhyme. So that is where poetry and music are very unusual. And often these bilingual artists will do very masterful, very complicated things with the rhyme. And my favorite thing that they do is when they do rhyme across languages, which is quite spectacular. Right? So you have a word like juez, and then that word is made to rhyme with I guess. And so you have to say, my goodness, I couldn't do that.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Well, thank you so much for enlightening me. I didn't know about the music portion of it, the I guess cross-contamination of language in it when it comes to that stuff. So I really appreciate you educating me and enlightening me on that kind of stuff. And it's been really interesting and enlightening because I can kind of have this information and apply it to now music. Since I'm in the border, I want to see how it is.
In fact, in El Paso, there's so many different musical styles that one can look at. And I am aware that in El Paso, there is a big hard rock scene, right? And that is bilingual sometimes, although rock and roll is not a style that you associate with Spanish a lot. In the United States, of course, you associate more Latin rhythms with use of Spanish and English, right? Like, I don't know, that Pitbull and his whatever's reggaeton. But I do know that there's a whole heavy metal sort of scene in El Paso, which is bilingual. And if I can, the problem with the studying those musical styles often is that it is hard to get the lyrics, because often there's no easy way to get the lyrics. They're not published. They are not, online. So you often have to just sit there and listen. I have transcribed and listened to more rancheras. Yes.
Thank you so much.
Not at all. Bye.
Bye-bye.